to introduce our second seminar, department seminar, or centre seminar, I should say, of 2021. This month we're going to be speaking with Lambros Fatsis, who is a lecturer in criminology and sociology at the University of Brighton. His research looks at a range of different topics, including issues relating to sociological theory. But today he's going to be talking to us about Black music and culture, and specifically the policing of Black music and culture. Following Lambros's presentation, which I think will last maybe about 25 minutes or so, him and I will have a brief discussion before opening the floor to questions. If you do have questions, there is a Q&A function at the bottom. So please do write your questions in the Q&A function rather than the chat function, so they're easier for me to follow. And without further ado, the floor is yours, Lambros.
Thank you, Adam, for inviting me and for being such a generous host. And indeed, I should also wish to thank everyone who has attended today. I am, I guess, excited and humbled in equal measure. Now, in terms of the title of my talk, I want to say something about that because it promises a history of policing against Black or Afro-diasporic musics. And although I will honour my promise, I should also clarify that what follows is not a chronological history where one date follows another, but a thematic one. So I will be picking out some recurring themes in the history of the policing of Black musics from the era of colonial slavery to the present day, in order to reflect on just what is it that haunts conventional perceptions of Black musics as violent, threatening, dangerous, and outrightly criminal. All of those words, of course, accompanied by scare quotes, just in case they're attributed to me or my way of thinking, which clearly they aren't. So what I wanted to start with is essentially drawing on some examples of how Black musics have been policed historically, drawing especially on UK grime and drill as the two most recent examples in British soil. And then I will move on to advance an argument about why Black music genres are singled out for police attention in the first place. Now, I should also clarify that throughout this talk, I use the term Black to refer to styles of music that are rooted in, evolve from, and establish a dialogue with cultural traditions of the African diaspora. So although the term Black has come to include African Caribbean, Asian, and other visible minority ethnic communities who are oppressed by racism, it is used here to exclusively refer to African diasporic Blackness. This is not meant to deny the term its coalitional meaning or its potential in global anti-racist movements, but to apply it more narrowly to specific Afro-diasporic cultures that are discussed here. And in so doing, I am silently echoing two essays by Stuart Hall, the first one being, what is this Black in Black popular culture? And the second one being, Africa is alive and well in the diaspora. I also think we have some slides, which I'm not sure if, are they already up, Adam?
Yeah, I've got them ready, so as soon as you're ready for me to share them, I can do them.
Let's go ahead. In that case, I'll just maybe ask people to really sharpen their imagination and try to depict what I will be talking about. So what you were going to see were three images that immediately come to my mind when I think about today's topic. So the first is a painting by Tam Joseph entitled Spirit of the Carnival, which I guess you can Google. And it depicts a wall of riot shields and a snarling dog forming a circle around a solo carnival masquerade deck, who is at the center of the stage. The second image, which I doubt you'll be able to Google, because it was a photo I took from the Backstreet Culture Museum in New Orleans. And what the image shows is a young boy, Sammy Wilson, from Trombone Shorty's brass band, parading down Royal Street with a sign around his neck which reads, "I was arrested for playing music." And indeed he was, because he violated the city's noise ordinance and taken to a juvenile detention center. The third image is a record sleeve, which is a classic record sleeves for all Greensleeves records, 12 inches, designed by Tony McDermott. And it features two police officers behind a reggae drummer in a scene that would otherwise radiate pulsating joy. So I guess my question when I look at those three images that you should normally be able to see but couldn't today. So when I look at those three images and when I think about those three images, the puzzling question that comes to my mind is, why on earth is policing so present in carnival, in brass band parades, and on reggae record sleeves? And the answer requires a brief glance into the history of how Black music expression has been suppressed across the African diaspora from the era of colonial rule to the present day. The story begins with the banning of African drumming and dancing in Britain's colonies in the Caribbean, in Africa, and that other former British colony, the US, of course, where slave patrol legislation was introduced to prevent, and I quote, all caballings amongst Negroes by dispersing of them when drumming or playing, unquote. Similar prohibitions were enforced under colonial rule in Africa in the form of bans of, I quote, noisy instruments, unquote, drums of African origin in all types of public meetings, and prohibitions on, I quote, playing objectionable native tunes, unquote, or, and I quote again, obscene songs, unquote. All of those quotes come from slave legislation in those various different places that I mentioned. Much the same applied to the banning of calypso or calypso in Trinidad. And as we move to the 19th and 20th century, we see the police harassment of blues music, brass band jazz, bebop, and hip hop. Oh, I can see that the images are up. So let's go to the previous slide if we can with the images. Great, fantastic. So as I was saying, after bebop and hip hop, carnival celebrations, West African Asiko music, Afro-Brazilian samba, Afro-Cuban music, South African Marabi music, and reggae sound systems in the UK faced similar suppression, paving the way for the criminalisation of bashment, garage, grime, and drill. Speaking of reggae sound systems, I want to say a few more things, just to illustrate the continuity in the policing of music genres that derived from the UK sound system reggae, and particularly grime and drill, on which I will focus a bit later. So the policing of UK reggae, which was the seed out of which hip hop and UK hip hop in particular grew, took the form of police raids that targeted house parties, blues dancers or turbines, youth clubs and other venues where ska, rocksteady and roots reggae were played. Charged with breaching licensing laws, exceeding permitted noise levels and encouraging drug consumption, UK reggae soon became police shorthand for dangerous individuals smoking illegal substances, as Lloyd Bradley playfully put it in his book, Bass Culture. Reggae dancers in the UK were therefore energetically pursued by police officers who often violently raided such events, turned sound systems down, damaged sound equipment, attacked sound system dancers, combined with discriminatory attitudes towards, and I quote, the criminalized, dreadlocked culture, unquote, of Rastafarians, creating the impression that the influence of Rastafari on the music amounted to, and I quote, an open commitment to terrorist violence, unquote, as a West Midlands police report stated. Mistaking the liberation theology and radical philosophy of Rastafari for terrorism or conflating UK reggae with criminality may be thought of as untypical deviations from the professional or ethical standards of British policing. The history of policing against Black Britons, though, and indeed through the discriminatory suppression of Black cultural life, suggests otherwise. In fact, the policing tactics that disproportionately affected Black people in the heyday of UK reggae sound systems from the late 50s to the late 80s were the very same tactics that monitored, regulated, and controlled Black British cultural life during the same period. And these include police presence in Black cultural events and the harassment of Black people in entertainment venues and public urban space through disciplinary methods that continue apace today with the same suspects in mind. To reflect on that continuity, I thought I'd illustrate it, this time not with images, but quotes from lyrics and literary texts. So if we could have the next slide, please, that would be great. Thank you very much. So what you see with the first one is an anonymous but well-known 18th century calypso that I'm deliberately quoting here from Cedric Robinson's magisterial Black Marxism, The Making of the Black Radical Tradition, as a reminder that this great book doesn't just give us an exhaustive history of capitalism as inherently racial, which Robinson certainly does by showing how capitalism's hierarchical nature sorts and ranks human beings on a scale that determines the worth and value that can be extracted from the labor. But it also gives us a snapshot of Black radicalism, not just in terms of the political structures that Black intellectuals and freedom fighters rebelled against, but also in terms of the cultural traditions that they fought such structures with, and music was indeed one of them. The second quote comes from a fictional character, the Harlemite Jess B. Semple, invented by Langston Hughes in a story about the birth of bebop music as a response to the way it was released as unruly and deviant. The third quote comes from raga and dancehall artist Anthony B. and his tune Police, which is, I guess, pretty self-explanatory, so I will say no more. Much like the three images from the previous slide, what these three quotes point to is that the policing against and those processes write themselves into legislation that is created to clamp down on Black music genres. In short, what we witness today is nothing more than new forms of policing that have a long pedigree and serve the same racist logic which targets the same genres, or rather, the most recent stylistic offshoots. So let us then move swiftly to the policing of UK grime and drill for a snapshot of such hostile, illegitimate, unjust, and discriminatory policing tactics. If we could kindly have the next slide, that'd be great. Thank you, Adam. Now, what a better way to start to discuss the criminalisation of UK grime and drill than with the wise words of such rap music and Black youth experts, Black youth culture experts like David Cameron and Cressida Dick. Of course, the former being a former Tory PM, and the latter being the current Commissioner of the London Metropolitan Police. Both can be seen as railing against grime and drill, respectively. So let us see how they made sure that their distaste towards grime and drill was translated into the criminalisation of those two rap subgenres. Starting with grime, its sonic and lyrical militancy. Great, thank you. Starting with grime, its sonic and lyrical militancy caught the attention of the London Metropolitan Police, especially following shootings and stabbings at live music events. Although, of course, there is no basis to infer anything but a coincidental link between crime and grime. This is not to play down the seriousness of isolated violent incidents in grime raves, but to refrain from making facile causal links between some incidents and the characteristics of an entire music genre, its performers and followers, in a process where atypical events are selected and presented in a stereotypical fashion that lends credence to the racist myth of Black criminality. In the case of grime, the discriminatory policing against it comes in the form of the Promotion Event Risk Assessment Form 696, in short, Form 696, which was launched by the Met in 2008 with the aim of identifying and minimizing any risk of most serious violent crime happening at the proposed event. And I'm quoting the form. The original version of the 696 form contained leading questions that directly targeted bashment, R&B, and garage artists, whose music is popular with young Black British audiences, although grime has been hardest hit by Form 696, leading to event cancellations, bashment bans, and club closures. Since it was first introduced, the 696 form was revised in 2009, a year later, and eventually withdrawn in November 2017, following a review ordered by the London Mayor Sadiq Khan. Following this, I guess, salutary development, the Met offered no apology for or confession to the form's discriminatory nature. It simply claimed that Form 696 was received negatively, and I quote here, by members of the London music industry, particularly around a perception that events associated with some genres of music were disproportionately affected by this process. This non-apology from the London Metropolitan Police is of course consistent with the way in which this 696 form was revised in 2009, where all mention of specific music genres by name was omitted, and promoters were no longer asked to specify the target audience for the planned event, or to provide details of, and I quote the form here, the makeup of the patrons, unquote, but the targeted events were still those that, and I quote from the form again, predominantly feature DJs or MCs performing to a recorded backing track, unquote. Given that the only musical genres that fit that description exclusively belong to the family of Black popular music, which involves the use of pre-recorded music as the sonic background against which MCs perform the lyrics, the wording changed, but the logic of the form remained intact. So Form 696 may have disappeared, but the logic that created it reigned supreme, as we will see with the policing of drill, to which we now turn. So very much like grime, UK drill found itself similarly maligned through media portrayals that liken it to a demonic and nihilistic soundtrack to London's murders, or even describe it as a knife crime rap. Indeed, the knife crime rap, and that was a cover from the Sunday Times magazine, implying a link between the music and a rise in knife crime, in ways that summon up racist stereotypes of Blackness as the embodiment of violence, aggression, and criminality. Following a number of violent incidents which involved drill rappers, the music soon became associated with fatal stabbings in the public and penal imagination. And in the aftermath of such brutal killings, the lyrical content and imagery of drill unsurprisingly came under police scrutiny. Video clips emerged of masked-up drill rappers issuing threats to rivals from different crews or neighborhoods and keeping a tally of stabbings on YouTube scoreboards. The response to such fatalities was fast, and it involved consolidating a new serious violence strategy and pursuing drillers as terror suspects under the Terrorism Act 2000. In addition to such measures, drill rappers became targeted by, threatened with, and subjected to criminal behavior orders, or CBOs, gun injunctions, suspended prison sentences, and the increased use of stop and search. Drillers were also banned from entire postcodes and forbidden to use certain words or refer to specific people and places in their lyrics. They were also prohibited from contacting or associating with certain people, wearing hoods, using social media or unregistered mobile phones, and they even had the videos removed from YouTube. Despite the lack of any tangible evidence to establish anything other than, once again, a coincidental link between knife crime and drill music, what was once an obscure black music subculture became synonymous with violent crime through a variety of discriminatory and illiberal policing tactics, call them racist, and prosecuting strategies that continue unabated. The latest development in the criminalisation of UK drill involves the use of drill lyrics and videos as evidence for the prosecution, despite difficulties in proving a direct link between specific lyrics and specific acts of violence. Now, none of the above is intended to downplay, deny, or condone the violence in some, but by no means all, drill lyrics. What is pointed out instead is the extraordinary breadth and weight of criminal justice responses that fail to meet the standards of evidence-based criminal justice policy. Such responses have unsurprisingly been described by criminologists like Johnny Ireland as inaccurate, unhelpful, counterproductive, and street illiterate, and indeed dismissed by the Youth Violence Commission as a populist distraction, and likened to an attack on civil liberties, social justice, and a criminal justice system whose legitimacy is called, rightly so, into question. Now that we have seen how grime has been policed, and indeed how drill has been policed, I would like us to attend to the question of what is being policed when black music genres like UK grime and drill are being policed. So if we could have the next slide, please. So black music, I will argue, symbolizes an unwanted presence through the way that it is treated as aesthetically out of tune, dissonant, culturally out of place, alien, and politically out of order, subversive and threatening to a cultural and social political order that is racialized as white. In this context, the criminal justice system becomes the judge of aesthetics, culture, and politics on the state's behalf and at its behest too. Police, prosecutors, and judges, therefore, become definers of culture in order to preserve order. Order maintenance assumes the guise of cultural evaluation to designate political belonging by establishing who and what fits the frame of white mainstream culture, and of course who and what doesn't. So the order that is being preserved through the policing of black expressive culture hierarchically assigns the place one can occupy in relation to white cultural norms. This, in turn, determines what activities require regulation, monitoring, surveillance, and control, if and when such activities are deemed to be beyond the pale, culturally as well as politically. Seized by law enforcement agencies, culture soon becomes transformed from a stage where creativity roams freely to an arena where the politics of difference are played out. Held hostage to such politics of law and order, the notion, function, and mission of culture is weaponized and transformed from a sphere of creative activity to a legal territory where the law decides, sorts, and orders what characteristics, standards, values, and criteria determine what belongs to the realm of creative expression and what becomes the property of the criminal justice system. In so doing, music is separated from noise. The former represents what is acceptable, desirable, celebrated, and cherished. while the latter, noise, symbolizes what is inadmissible, unwanted, out of place, out of order, and out of the limits of propriety, respectability, and acceptability, not just aesthetically, but culturally and politically too. Such norm images of blackness, if we can call them that, as a dangerous and threatening cultural force in the white mind, establish hierarchies of belonging and exception that can only be understood at the crossroads of the sensory and the political realm. Hence my use of the phrase out of tune, out of place, and out of order. After all, it is in this very context that Black music genres become forms of sensory as well as cultural and political, as sensory and political noise, therefore, is introduced here as a conceptual handle with which we can fully grasp the cultural and political processes by which Black music genres become types of incivility, instead of being recognized as valid forms of creative expression. Judged by the standards and established principles of European traditions of music composition, Black music becomes perceived as aesthetically and culturally out of place, due to its emphasis on the low-frequency drum, polyrhythm, call and response, interactivity, improvisation, montage, syncopation, and sonic sensibilities that deviate from classical European or Western soundscape norms, as Monique Charles calls it. So the phrase soundscape norms comes from the brilliant work of Monique Charles. Using rhythmic speech, rap, low-frequency infrasound, sub-bass, and remixing practices like sampling and versioning, Black music stands out as intrinsically different, if not entirely separate from Eurocentric aesthetic conventions. And it is that deviant cultural character of Black music genres, therefore, that excludes them from the pantheon of art, by consigning them to the margins of refinement, propriety, and respectability. This is due to prohibitive definitions that prevent mainstream culture to take Black music seriously, as anything other than a source of dissonance and incivility. After all, as Howard Becker notes in a little-known essay, What About Mozart? What About Murder? What counts as music involves, and I quote him, the moral evaluation of noise. As a result, aesthetic appreciation is reduced to culturally codified principles of acceptability, which imprison audiences to conventional ways of making and listening to music, which represent the choice of very few from all the possible ways of making music. So if what counts as music is a culturally loaded decision-making process about the normative value of sound, what counts as noise also falls prey to definitions of pleasantness, politeness, civility, and their polar opposites, namely rudeness, disturbance, and incivility. Unlike music, however, noise is the sonic equivalent of dirt, matter out of place, and a threat to good order. And I'm adapting here Mary Douglas's masterful analysis of uncleanliness to noise as a source of pollution, which violates cultural taboos of aesthetic purity and signifies danger. So moving from the sensory to the political realm, noise loses none of the repulsion with which it is treated, apart from shifting the context in which such distaste takes place. So if noise is dismissed as disorder, dirt, pollution, it is also feared on the political level as what Jacques Attali calls an aggression against the code structuring messages of conventional or mainstream culture, resembling, as Attali refers to it, as a weapon which does violence and disrupts the existing social order by threatening to create new orders, unstable and changing. So what attracts such feelings of anxiety is not the tone or the lyrical message of the music, but the potential of such music to escape the confines of culture by spilling into, diluting, or even transforming the nature, order, political culture, and ethnic or racial makeup of white civil society. And the two quotes that you've been looking at on the slide in front of you by and indeed some of his theoretical successors, this being, of course, Max Horkheim and Theodor Adorno, I guess are an illustration of all of what I've been saying so far. And I wanted to share those quotes precisely because we're being taught to revere those figures, particularly those with a social theory background like mine. Having so far traced the ideological, historical, and political contours of how grime and drill become branded, stigmatized, and policed against as criminal, the processes that render young Black people suspicious and dangerous because of the music are also exposed. And this is of utmost significance for understanding how the criminal justice system, and I quote Frederick Douglass here, imputes crime to color, as Douglass put it. Understanding the criminalization of Black music cultures, therefore, requires an understanding of how race is seen as an active ingredient of crime and how crime is seen as an intrinsic feature of race. This brings us to policing itself, which the criminalization of grime and drill make visible as an order maintenance institution rather than a crime fighting tool. Seen this way, mythological portrayals of the police as crime fighters fade when confronted by empirical evidence and historically sound scholarship that reintroduces the police as the state's means of coercion or as a political tool for enforcing an unequal social order. Rethinking the police as a political agent in the fabrication of social order, rather than a neutral, benevolent state institution for public safety, allows us to ponder over what is so dangerous about Black music, other than the threat it poses an unequal, racial social order that the police serve and protect. Such a political take on the mission of policing is useful in reminding us what policing is, what it does, to whom and for whom. But it also reintroduces the target of policing, crime, not just as a problem, but as a problematic term, which acquires its meaning from its political uses. If we could have the next slide, please. Thank you, Adam. And you see much of what I said in just a nutshell in the lyrics of Practical and in the track on Drill. And what such a reorientation of our thinking about the politics of crime and criminal justice in the light of the policing of Black music does is that it prompts us to refocus our intellectual energies on otherwise unnoticed features of social control that tie aesthetics, culture, and criminal justice politics and policy as well as politics together in a unique way that helps us see the connections between them. So Black music does not become detestable noise, as Hegel put it, independently of the cultural and racial prejudices which single it out for police attention. Rather, it is transformed into a crime because it is processed as such by the criminal justice system. Critical investigations into the policing of Black music, therefore, lead us to draw on different sources and modes of knowledge. And if we listen carefully, we might discover how and why the metropolitan officer who patrols the nation is the modern reincarnation of the colonial overseer who rode in the plantation, as the legendary rapper KRS-One rhymed, in a lyric that speaks volumes for the current limits and future possibilities of the ways in which we think about policing. So to conclude, all I have tried to do today is introduce a different note into our thinking about policing with, as well as through Black music, to better understand how race has been policed through music from the era of colonial slavery to the present day. Thank you all. And the next slide includes some references if anybody needs them.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Lambros. Can everybody hear me okay? Is my internet working? Yes, so, thank you, Violet, for letting me know. Brilliant. Apologies, everyone, for the horrendous technical difficulties at the start of Lambros' presentation. So, as I mentioned before, we have a Q&A option at the bottom of your screen in between participants and chat. Hopefully, you should see a Q&A option. We've had lots of people making contributions in the chat, which is great, but no questions yet. So, while people start to think up and perfectly word their very succinct questions, I'm going to offer a couple of questions to Lambros to maybe get us warmed up a little bit. I thought your presentation was brilliant. I lost internet for maybe about 5 minutes, so I'm not going to comment on probably the 3 to 8 minutes into your presentation. But one of the things that it really made me think about was how moral panics, so again drawing on Stuart Hall, doesn't simply rely on crime and perceptions of crime, but it relies on categories of crime. So the mugging isn't a crime. Gang crime isn't a crime. Knife crime isn't a crime. None of these things are crimes, right? They're categories of crime, which kind of vacuum up all of these existing offences to create the impression there is a new problem, to create the impression there is a different problem, as if there were no stabbings in Victorian London or in 17th century London, as if large organised crime didn't exist before, the post-war period, etc., etc. And I think that using these new cultural formations which are arising play a really useful role in demonstrating the newness or the apparent newness of these criminal problems, of these social problems, in ways that I think are really interesting and powerful. And I think that linking the way in which you did the invention or the construction or the production, I should say, of knife crime as a phenomenon, which kind of emerges in the press, I guess, in around 2005, 2006, and then really takes off 2007, 2008, and before that, the phrase knife crime really doesn't exist, and you would have thought that's because no one ever used a knife in a crime before 2003, but of course that's not the case. And so I think that's a really interesting way of thinking through it, and of course this enables the police and the state to have a number of powers. You talked about criminal behaviour orders. There are others such as knife crime prevention orders, which can be imposed on children as young as 12 or 13, which can prevent them from going to a specific place, speaking to certain people, going to their college or their school, making music or using social media, a whole host of things that are really difficult to stop any young person from living a meaningful existence. And if they violate that or break that particular injunction, they can be put in prison for 2 years, which is remarkable that someone who hasn't committed a criminal offence, has no evidence that they've committed a criminal offence, can have an injunction put upon them based on police evidence. And then by watching YouTube or seeing a friend or family member, which has been prohibited by the police, they can be put in prison for 2 years. And this is children as young as 13 or 14. So the levels of authoritarianism are breathtakingly chilling, I think. And I think music plays a really powerful role in presenting this kind of evidence and character defamation to judges, to juries, as well as to the courtroom of the general public in our tabloid and mainstream media. I think there are kind of three kind of big questions that I thought would be good to expand on before we take questions. Oh, we've got one question already, but before we get, I'm sure, many more questions from our audience. The first is, I think, something interesting about how culture is, of course, one of the most powerful ways in which racism is articulated. We know historically, religion was one of the first ways in which racism was articulated against non-Christian peoples, whether they be Jewish people in Europe or non-Christian peoples in the Americas and Africa and elsewhere. And then in the late 19th and early 20th century, the science of eugenics and what have you became a popular way of articulating racism. Whereas in the post-war period, it's culture that is the way in which we see racism often articulated, about certain groups of people having a deficit culture in one way or another. And I think that therefore clinging on to these kind of cultural signifiers is even more powerful today perhaps than it's ever been. So I think something about that is quite interesting. I think expanding on your ideas of music as resistance, as I think, is also really interesting, particularly as on the one hand, it's not uncommon for states and imperial powers to frame resistance to their power as irrational, as violent, as unthinking, as chaotic, right? Rather than a predictable response to oppression and exploitation. And the final thing I wanted to ask you about is about when Black musical genres do become in place, are considered to be part of the order, are considered to be in tune, like jazz music, for instance, or certain parts of hip hop, mainstream people like Jay-Z maybe, or even certain parts of reggae is considered to be in place and in tune and part of the dominant order. And I was wondering if you could maybe comment on that kind of pivot that we see the state kind of engaging in, maybe with Black musical genres appearing less threatening in hindsight, historically. And then I'll take questions. That's okay.
I mean, that's a very good point, and I guess each of those examples has a certain particularity. I mean, for part of this has to do with the commodification of those genres, and with the fact that they're being domesticated as part of being in tune and being at home with the dominant sort of weight, white mainstream culture. So, for instance, jazz is associated as something very intellectual, very sophisticated, and quite homey in the sense that people go to coffee shops and listen to jazz, and there's no hint of the transgressiveness of the genre in it, which is not to say that it doesn't reside in the music, but it's just that this transgressiveness is forgotten. And it's forgotten because that is not the genre that is currently being policed against. But as we saw earlier in the talk I gave, with particularly in relation to the quotes that I gave, jazz was once one of those really, really dangerous and problematic musics, but it became commodified, it became acceptable, it became embraced actually in the US as a typically American gift to the world, and in fact was even used in the Cold War era in order to play down the racism in the States and say, well, look, we're sending Dizzy Gillespie in Egypt to play gigs, therefore how on earth can we be racist, right? We're embracing that music as American. It is as American as apple pie, because Dizzy gets to play gigs in the Middle East and in Russia and so on and so forth. So I guess part of that, what I'm trying to allude to here, is the way that the state decides to domesticate rather than police particular music or not. And the passage of time has something to do with that. Now, and I guess the same goes with hip hop and certain bits of hip hop, right? So obviously Jay-Z is more easily domesticated than Tribe Called Quest, for instance, right? Nobody would be able to domesticate those lyrics and those sounds, precisely because they contain a critique of the state, a critique of power, a critique of racial order, a critique of injustice. So that is rather difficult to domesticate in that regard. But equally, what is really, really absurd and paradoxical and contradictory is that although drill is, public enemy number one now, it is also extremely popular, extremely commodified, and actually, people make money out of it. And when I say people, I don't just mean the producers of the music, but Spotify has drill playlists. Nothing could be more mainstream than Spotify. And there's various others, video sharing platforms, as like YouTube, for instance, who make a mint out of drill. And indeed, partly because of I guess of the titillation that it offers to viewers of, this is the really sort of criminal soundtrack of London. This is what gang membership sounds like. Forgetting, of course, that much of this is fictional, much of it is scripted, and much of those sort of gang personas are exactly that. They are personas. And they are created as personas, and they're exaggerated wildly as such, precisely because the stuff sells. And people forget that. And that also, and I just want to connect that to what you said earlier, that also filters through the courtroom as well. Whereas those lyrics and those personas and those videos and the imagery in those lyrics and videos is used as factual, literal truth, rather than as fictional first-person narratives, which of course we wouldn't do with any other music genre or any other form of artistic expression. So, when philosophers use the first person, or novelists use the first person, we never confuse the narrator with the author, and we never claim that the author commits whatever violent acts the narrator might do, or the protagonist in that novel. Yet we do that with rap music and its various offshoots. Including drill. So what is interesting there is that its status as an art form is denied, because that's what allows it to be criminalized. You're essentially saying this is not possibly, this is not music, right? This is noise that we need to clear the body politic from. And since it is not an art form, then it doesn't follow the protections of an art form. It cannot possibly be intellectual production. It cannot possibly be fictional. It cannot possibly be a work of the imagination. So it has to be an expression of criminal minds. And as such, we can use it in order to emotively manipulate jurors by showing it, as indeed prosecutors do, as bad character evidence, which is no evidence at all, because you cannot prove anything whatsoever unless you have tangible, concrete evidence to say that because X happened, Y happened. But the use of drill lyrics and videos in the courtroom serve precisely that function, to discredit the defendant and say, well, look at what they, spit and rap about. Look at what imagery they, the videos contain. They're not respectable people. They should not be trusted. They're violent. They're aggressive. The criminal, and that's why you should charge them. Not because we, as the prosecutors, have the evidence to charge them with the crimes that they're charged with, but these are bad people who we need to remove from, our cultural, social, and political order. So that's how the sensory, the cultural, and the political come together, I guess. And that's as full an answer as I can muster to the comments that you made, Adam.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Lambros. And in that time, we've got some questions through from our audience. So I'm going to hit you with them now. The first question is from a representative from the Association of Calypsonians and Soca Artists. And the question is Black music seen as threatening to the establishment by bringing social problems to the fore until it becomes popular and taken up by white musicians? E.g. Lord Woodbine, the Calypsonian, and even the Beatles, who nurtured their stardom. The person is from someone called Vincent. Thank you, Vincent.
Yeah, I mean that's a brilliant question. The short answer is of course yes. So something can become part of sort of mainstream cultural identity if the sting is removed from it. As often happens. Yet the interesting thing here is that music has been policed precisely because of its insurrectionary potential. And that's what I tried to illustrate today, perhaps not as clearly, but that's where I was getting to. That the banning of drumming during slavery was precisely one of the very first things that colonial militias were formed to do, because they feared that might be a form of communication between the enslaved, and also might inspire them to rebel against colonial rule. So we can't possibly have that. How could you possibly allow, radical ideas to circulate which might threaten to undermine, the status quo? So that applies as much as it does in the era of colonial slavery as it does today, because much of what sounds so harrowing and shocking in drill is indeed the circulated in those lyrics. And indeed, the perception changes when the protagonists who make that music change too. And that's why, I guess, tongue-in-cheek, I showed you that album cover by Eminem, with music to be murdered by, which somehow it's rendered, less threatening when Eminem has that cover, right? Because it's kind of seen as tongue-in-cheek, but it wouldn't be tongue-in-cheek if this was a black young boy from a council estate in London making drill beats. They would find themselves, essentially streamlined through the criminal justice system and in court. So much so that the CPS, the Crown Prosecution Service, actually has new prosecutorial guidelines which link drill to gangs and gangs to social media in one sentence. So the assumption is already made that if you're making drill, you're part of a gang. If you're part of a gang, you're using social media in order to somehow create a sense of community among gang members, and you're essentially just using music as a vehicle for your gang activity. So in the state's mind, drill and gangs are already related, and social media is the tool that is being used to, broadcast those gang-related activities of drill. And mind you, there is no empirical evidence whatsoever to suggest that link. So what we see there is essentially, what we could call procedural racism. It's written into the legislation. So we have those normative assumptions that write themselves into legislation without any evidence whatsoever. So again, this is how the sensory, the cultural, the political come together. Because in that one phrase, in the CPS deciding that drill gangs and social media come together, or particularly the drill and gangs come together, despite any evidence, despite the fact that there is no evidence to suggest such a link, yet this is how people are prosecuted. Right? These are the guidelines that prosecutors draw on in order to criminalize drill.
Brilliant. Okay, we've got a question here from Chrissy, who thanks you for a very helpful and detailed insight, and asks, what do you suggest is the best way to influence the Home Office and policing to adapt their response to Black music?
Well, it depends who you ask. Because you asked me, I would say these would be the wrong people to speak to. I don't think that any state agency is reformable, right? I'm an abolitionist, so I would say that. And the reason why I would say that, and indeed other people like me would say that, is because by advising, by advising people and people who make policies and logics that make policies that are discriminatory, essentially all that one is trying to do is just make oppression more bearable, which I don't think is the point. And anyway, it's not in the interest of the state to be more equal or to be more accepting, because it depends on repression and extraction. That's what states do. I mean, if one traces the political history of states, and I know that sounds completely crazy and radical, but one just has to read the work of Charles Tilly, for example, hardly a radical scholar at all. And most of his work illustrates precisely how state making, in other words, the origins of state making, are both extractive and repressive. They thrive on extracting value out of people who are subjugated and subordinated as a disposable workforce, and of course in other ways too. So to go to the state for I don't know, for help in creating social equality would be against its logic, would be against its historical mission and function. But of course, if one wanted to, right? So I want to allow that possibility, of course, for anyone who might want to approach things that way. I guess hitting them with the available evidence might be one way. But mind you, people have been doing this for centuries, and it doesn't lead to anything, because if the state and its criminal justice institutions decide something, evidence doesn't matter. It doesn't matter to them. They do not consult the evidence. Take stop and search, for example. There is no, all the evidence on its use is that it is not just, if anybody cared, discriminatory and openly racist, but ineffective too. Yet is the most popular policing tactic, the policing tool ever. So what does that tell you? It tells you that there's decades and decades and decades and decades and decades of research that points that this policing tool should be scrapped, which, by the way, comes from 19th century legislation, the Vagrancy Act, which essentially criminalizes free movement on public spaces at the very time where Britain happens to be an empire still. Again, all of those things are connected. Yet police chiefs and a lot of criminologists as well, from the mainstream, support the use of stop and search, despite all evidence to the fact that it is discriminatory and ineffective other than as a racist tool of policing, I'm afraid. So I guess, again, I've given you a very long answer, which is to say I personally wouldn't speak to the Home Office or to the police. Or I might, but I would with evidence and make them feel rather uncomfortable about the fact that what they do is not based on evidence and is not based on ethical principles, unless, of course, we consider white supremacy an ethical principle, which I clearly don't.
Cool. I'm gonna abuse my position of chair and ask a follow-up question on behalf of Chrissy. I'm just reading Chrissy's mind here, which is, if it's not the Home Office and policing that should be we should be trying to influence, how do you think the policing of Black music can or could be challenged? Or maybe is being challenged, if you can think of any examples.
It's a hard one. I mean, okay, so putting it that way, I guess, so I would reflect on some work that I do by being an expert witness in cases where drill lyrics and videos make it as sources of evidence. So I would say challenging that tactic using the law is possible, as a temporary interim thing to just stop this, this trend of over-criminalization of Black music genres. So I guess, using evidence and intervening in places in order to discredit those tactics is a good step. But it is a step. It's not the end to it all. And I guess maybe, that might sound strange, but also, encouraging voices who have a political imagination to encourage them to produce music of that sort and find spaces in order to host that music and so on and so forth. So I'm not suggesting that all drill is political here, right? But for example, a track like Band Drill by Crepton Conan definitely is. So creating room and creating space for young people to articulate their opposition to such tactics is also important. That might not be a policy-related thing, but it is absolutely vital, I think, as cultural and political expression. So I guess those who can oppose and discredit such heavy-handed tactics should. in any way they can, but also giving, more weight and support to the people who are being criminalized is equally important too, be it through the support of youth clubs or labels or whatever programs there are around that give voice to young people whose views and beats are otherwise silenced.
Brilliant. And of course, another example of a victory is probably the scrapping of Form 696,
yes,
which arose out of, I guess, a coalition of artists and lawyers and kind of community campaigners who forced, I guess, the Mayor of London and the police to scrap the racist.
Exactly. And what's important there is that campaign was instrumental in doing that, but the way it was kind of co-opted by Sadiq Khan was by just focusing on the impact that form would have on the nighttime economy, not on discriminating grime artists, but on the nighttime economy, on the money that clubs bring. So that's interesting, because that campaign, that was not the aim of the campaign. The aim of the campaign was to stop criminalizing the music that we love. That was the whole, purpose of the campaign, and as well to point out the racism that enables that policing of crime. And some really big names were involved in that. JME, for instance, was very much involved in that, as with so many other things.
Great. Okay, we've got another question here. This is quite a long question, so I hope you're listening carefully. This person says, I'm persuaded by your turning rebellion into money commodification arguments. But in Stuart Hall fashion, I would like to ask about the conjunctural and hegemonic significance of this criminalisation now. Given that the race crime fixation, which has thrown up mugging, gangs, gun crime, knife crime, etc., even county lines, at a time when a noxious form of little post-colonial England is seeking to reassert itself?
How do I answer that? I mean, I guess it's a comment rather than a question. It kind of answers itself in many ways, because it exposes the very mentalities that produce that criminalization. And again, I would just come back to those three phrases I used: the sort of out of tune, dissonant, out of place, alien, and out of order, subversive or transgressive. Because drawn together, one understands that the links between them are not accidental. So what is considered and consigned as noise aesthetically, as well as culturally, then also denotes, a position of unbelonging culturally and politically too. So therefore, if you don't belong and what you produce is detestable noise, to use again Friedrich Hegel's phrase from the 19th century, then you do not belong. You should be eradicated. Everything you do, your very personhood, your modes of expression, your political expression should also be eradicated. You should not be here. You do not belong here. You need to be evicted. You need to be removed from the body politic because you have a parasitic presence on the cultural, social, and political sphere. That is the thinking. And that thinking, it has, I wouldn't say imperialist roots, I would say imperialist reverberations into the present. So yes, in a post-colonial context, essentially, imperialism doesn't necessarily change. It might change forms, but it doesn't change its logic, and it doesn't change its outcomes either. And that's why that historical dimension that I wanted to bring today becomes important, because we just tend to see those things as shockingly new, but there's a very, very long history and a very long, reason why those things keep on happening. And the reasons why they keep on happening is because of the racist logics that pervade an entire political system and a particular social and political order too. And that's why it's important to read, people like Cedric Robinson, because those things become together. British capitalism is not different from racism, and indeed that's why his notion of racial capitalism becomes important, because it shows you that we're essentially dealing with an order that is marked by hierarchies of race, class, gender, and so on and so forth. And we have to view those things in their totality. And when we do, then we understand why the state behaves the way that it does, because that is its prehistory. That's how it uses its power. That's how it thinks. That's how it acts. So none of this, should be surprising. So that's why cultural categories that we are supposed to be shocked by emerge, be it the mugger, the drill rapper, the yardie, the gangster, the grime MC, whoever it might be. They all point to the same category of cultural villains that threaten, threaten our social order. And the emphasis is on the our, right? There's an assumed we-ness there. There's an assumed togetherness there, which is subtly and implicitly racialized as white. It is obvious who the audience is, and it is obvious who needs to be excluded from that conversation. So I think all of those things are really related. So one could say, I guess if I were to answer, or respond to that comment with one sentence, is that, the reason why such music genres are being policed is because they're audibly un-British, with everything that means. Because the sounds, the people who make them, and the outcome of such expressions simply do not belong here, should not belong here. Therefore, they need to be removed. And what better way to do it than, marshalling the powers of the criminal justice system in order to suppress that presence? That sonic reminder that people who do not look like us also belong here.
Great. So those are actually the end of our questions for this afternoon. And so I just want to thank you again, Lambros Fatsis from Brighton University, lecturer in criminology and sociology. I want to apologise again for the technical difficulties we had, and thank Karen for stepping in and saving the day. And if any of you would like to learn more about Lambros's work, I suggest you go to his website on the University of Brighton page. You can look at the articles that he's written, but some of them are journal articles, but lots of them are freely available kind of journalistic blog pieces as well, which are really brilliant. Is there anything else you'd like to plug, Lambros, before we go?
Not particularly. I mean, no, I don't think so. I mean, I'd love to take more questions, but since we don't have time for that, then I have nothing.
Oh no, one second. I think we've got another question actually. Sorry, okay. No, we've got time for another question.
Let's take it up. I'll try to be as brief as I can.
No, we've got time. I thought that was the end of questions. Okay, so we've got a question from Yasmin Foster. Thank you for your lecture. Many scholars over many years have questioned and unpacked the violent policing of Black music. Black people are policed for their music, from their music to their hair. We know this. This is done. But why? It's quite a big question.
So I would say, again, precisely because of I'm going to use that phrase again, the referring to what is out of tune, out of place, and out of order. That is why, because Black people and their expressive cultures are seen as dissonant, alien, and unbelonging. That is why. I mean, that's the short sort of version to it, and we know this because it is selectively done in such a way. And I think that's important to remember. That when you have such arguments about, violence and criminality and so on, and you apply it to only one range of public cultural expression, then automatically you might want to broaden the frame and say, well, okay, why do we not object to the misogyny in Nietzsche's philosophical writing? Why is this a key text in philosophy? Why do we not object to, the horrendous gang violence in Homer's Iliad? Why do we not object to various other works of art and great literary and intellectual achievement that are hailed as the canon that we all need to be educated into, yet we only, focus on specific forms of cultural expression? And partly that's why I showed you the quotes from Hegel and Adorno and Horkheimer, because you know, even the most sort of critical scholars and a lot of lefties read Hegel and read Adorno and Horkheimer as you know, critical thinkers. And the reason why I wanted to show you those quotes is to say, well, critical thinkers, all right, but this is what they have to say about entire civilizations in the case of Hegel, and indeed entire music genres in the case of Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno, who are writing about jazz in that same passage in the Dialectics of Enlightenment as something that is even threatening to reason and to scientific rationality, and it's something that weakens the scientific rationality in deeply racist and utterly ignorant language too. So that is the why. The why has to do something with the way that Black expression, Black forms of expression, for diasporic forms of expression, are seen as dissonant, alien, and politically subversive and unbelonging. And I think that's why it's so helpful and important to read things like Policing the Crisis by Stuart Hall and his colleagues, and Paul Gilroy's There Ain't No Black in the Union Jack, because you get that combination of the structural and the cultural together to understand, you know, what is being policed when Black people are being policed. And in the case of music, it's essentially race policed through music. And of course, race only exists as a classificatory category because of the logic that produces it, which is racism. So I hope that helps as an answer, or an attempt to anyway.
Yeah, and it also makes me think about the point you made about the importance of thinking through Cedric Robinson and about how racism should be seen as serving a specific function, right? It serves a function that enables capitalism to differently exploit different people, to control or coerce different groups of people, right, to reproduce its power. And so in order to exploit Black people differently to the way in which, for instance, white people might be exploited, it serves capitalism's interests, or racial capitalism's interests, to dehumanize them and dehumanize their music and their culture and what have you, which that can thus therefore deem them more exploitable, more disposable, more deserving of control or violence, or disciplinary power in one way or the other.
And also, you know, to go back to the very, very first question, I think by the people who asked about Calypso, what is interesting is that, and it's brilliant that Cedric Robinson does that, because we often read him only as a structuralist writer, but what he manages to do in that book is a structural critique of capitalism, but also showing how the Black radical tradition, okay, he focuses on C.L.R. James, Richard Wright, and Du Bois, W.E.B. Du Bois, but he also refers to music, that music is part of that Black radical tradition. And that renders it even more threatening. Why? Precisely because of its radical content, not just musically and aesthetically, but the fact that it is perceived as a potential disruption of the current social order, as it was during slavery and as it is today, because of its insurrectionary potential, because its potential to be rebellious, its potential to, you know, ostensibly overthrow the existing social order, which has a positive aspect to it as well. The positive aspect to it is that clearly the stuff is powerful, right? So I guess, you know, to link the other question as well about the Home Office, instead of talking to the Home Office, I think it might be better for us to be in conversation with the Black radical tradition in sound, or indeed, you know, in the form of other art forms within that tradition too.
Okay, we've got time for one more question. It's come from Kwaku, who's asking about class as well as race and the banning of punk gigs and other musical genres which might not necessarily be associated with Black communities.
I mean, okay, to go back to Stuart Hall, who I think we've mentioned so many times today, which is great, of course, that goes without saying. You know, who used that really beautiful way of answering the whole race and class thing by saying that, you know, race is the modality through which classes live. So it's the medium, the mode through which classes live. Both are forms that denote, a subordinate position in a particular hierarchy. So they should never be thought of as distinct, because they overlap more often than not. So, and again, that's why Cedric Robinson is referring to racial capitalism as something that, that brings those two words together. That capitalist exploitation is also racial, as it is gendered, as it is, as it also happens on the plane of heteronormative patriarchy and so on and so forth. But to go to the issue of punk and other forms of Black music, I'm a bit skeptical about that link, in the sense that yes, there have been criticisms of punk, but I don't think we can equate the way that Black music have been policed with the way that punk has been criticized, in the sense that I don't know of any legislation that is specifically designed for punk. I mean, think about this. For drill, we have specific legislation that is created against drill in the form of CPS guidelines, gang injunctions, CBOs, the new serious violence reduction orders, partly target drill, and so on and so forth. So, we are talking about the state literally making laws against you, which I think is qualitatively different to saying that, okay, we don't really like Johnny Rotten, making fun of the Queen and praising anarchy and so on and so forth. I mean, if you're a young Black drill rapper, you can't even use your mate's name, let alone speak against the Queen. So there's a huge qualitative difference there. You can't even mention your local chicken shop 2 minutes away from here, because that might be seen as a hub of criminality where you and your mates gather, in order to subvert and overthrow the Queen's speech. So that's how I would respond to that, in the hope that my sarcasm is not misunderstood as directed to the person who asked that question, but rather the things I'm talking about. I mean, Adam knows me a little, so he knows that sarcasm is a feature of how I think and speak.
No, that's brilliant. That's a brilliant answer to the question, and brilliant end, I think, to the seminar. So that definitely is. I scrolled all the way down. That is the end of our questions now. Thank you so much again, Lambros Fatsis, for
very welcome.
Joining the Centre for Applied Sociology. Thank you very much, everyone, for attending. And I hope you look forward to next month's presentation, which will be from Malcolm James, who will be presenting on his new book, Sonic Intimacy, continuing our focus on music and thinking through the different kind of forms of Black musical subgenres, including jungle, ragga, and grime, as they have existed over the past 20 or 30 years in this country. So hopefully see you all there. Thanks very much.